Hello, I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com. We're going to consider the informal version of the reductio ad absurdum. And we have two primary examples here. The first example is from Plato's Republic, and the second example will be from the great economist Frederick Bastiat, who was a master at the reductio ad absurdum. Let's take a step back and define some terms here. So we have the reductio ad absurdum, and that is a reduction to absurdity. Now, the popular reductio ad absurdum argument can be employed in two different ways. On the one hand, we have the formal version, and on the other hand, we have the informal version. But either way, we can think of the reductio ad absurdum as a valid form of modus tollens. In other words, we have first premise, if P, then Q. Second premise, not Q, because either Q is a contradiction and that is the formal version of the reductio ad absurdum, or it is plainly absurd in some other way. And that is the informal version of the reductio ad absurdum. Conclusion, thus, not P. So if P, then Q, not Q, thus not P. The formal version is also known as an indirect proof, or a proof by contradiction. In this type of argument, we validly derive a contradiction, but since the contradiction cannot be true, whatever led to that contradiction cannot be true. As Aristotle famously told us, the most certain of all basic principles is that contradictory propositions are not true simultaneously. We can't say P and not P is true. That's an outright contradiction. So if we derive a contradiction, we know that there's a problem. The informal version doesn't lead to an outright contradiction. Instead, it just leads to a falsehood or implausibility. Let's imagine we're examining a worldview. To determine its truth, we first look at its premises. We might then take those premises to validly derive some conclusions, and perhaps one of those conclusions is obviously false. But insofar as we have an obviously false conclusion, and that was validly derived, we therefore have good reason to reject that worldview, or at least one premise of it. So we can think of it this way. We have premises of worldview X. So we have P sub 1, P sub 2, and so on down to P sub n. And then we have a derivation. And it is a valid derivation. And we get an absurd conclusion Y. And then we can get the conclusion that we reject worldview X. And this is very handy in debate. Your opponent supports position X. You show that X has a logical consequence Y, and that Y is absurd, thus we should reject worldview X. Now, to be sure, we might question, how do we know we have an absurd conclusion? What is an absurd conclusion? So the formal version of the reductio ad absurdum leads to an outright contradiction. We have definitive proof. But with the informal version, things are a little bit more murky. What does it mean to be absurd? And how do we reply to somebody who takes what we find to be absurd not to be absurd? Or are there occasions when the so-called absurd consequences of a set of premises should be accepted as true? But to give an example, let's say with this worldview, let's say it's an ethical system. And this moral philosophy, if true, leads to denying the immorality of torturing innocent people. However, because it's absurd to deny the immorality, this moral philosophy should be rejected. That seems to me a good, basic principle. So obviously torturing innocent people is bad, but if this worldview leads to that conclusion that it's okay, then that worldview must be false. So we have a reductio ad absurdum in this informal sense. Now with that in mind, let's look at our two primary examples. And the first one is from Plato. So note that there are two main issues in Plato's Republic. First, what is justice? Second, how should the ideal city, also known as Callipolis, the beautiful city, be organized? So Socrates seeks an answer, and he first comes to Kepler. Now, Socrates is really famous in Plato's dialogues of making informal reductio ad absurdum arguments. So he would logically demonstrate through a series of back and forth questioning the absurdity of someone's position. And this would constitute Socrates' elenchus, which means refutation, his refutation of the opponent. And so in Plato's Republic, he wants to know what is justice. So he first comes to Cephalus. Cephalus, a rich old man, tells Socrates that justice is only about following customary rules or paying your debts. But then Socrates replies to this. Does this always lead to justice or right results? What if a murderer or madman wants his knife back? Now, if you follow Kepler's advice, then justice demands that you give it back to him. But Socrates argues you shouldn't give it back. Thus, since the view of Cephalus leads to an absurd conclusion, we should reject that view. Justice is not just about paying your debts or following customary rules. So we have an absurd conclusion from this worldview, so we should reject this worldview, we should reject this theory. Now the second example is from the economist Frédéric Bastiat, the French economist Frédéric Bastiat. And he was a master, as I said, at the reductio ad absurdum. And here we're considering the essay, The Candlemaker's Petition. Here Bastiat talks about how candles have an unfair competition with the sun. So why not snuff out the sun? Imagine the economic boost that candle makers would receive. To quote Bastiat directly, quote, "What we pray for is that it may please you to pass a law ordering the shutting up of all windows, skylights, dormer windows, outside and inside shutters, curtains, blinds, bull eyes. In a word, of all openings, holes, chinks, cliffs, and fissures, by or through which the light of the sun has been in use to enter houses, to the prejudice of the meritorious manufactures with which we flatter ourselves that we have accommodated our country, a country that, in gratitude, ought not to abandon us now to strife so unequal." So here we have the following argument. Sometimes it's argued that protective tariffs are needed because, one, due to unfair competition that offers low-cost goods, and two, to economically boost specific industries. So Bastiat's argument shows absurd consequences if we logically follow these arguments consistently. And because of that, we should reject this particular type of protective tariff argument. So this is an example from Frédéric Bastiat's The Candlemaker's Petition and from Plato's Republic. I'm the Amateur Logician from amateurlogician.com. This is George, the Amateur Logician. If you enjoyed this video, note that it's based on a page at my website, amateurlogician.com, the Reductio ad Absurdum Arguments page, and there you will see a guide to the formal version of the Reductio ad Absurdum with some examples. Some examples come from philosophy, some from mathematics, including proving that the square root of 2 is irrational, and I give some references there. But also I have information on the informal version of the Reductio ad Absurdum, including the two examples I have given on this video, namely the one with Socrates and the economist Bastiat. Now, if you go to my website, by the way, you'll see that there's an extensive tutorial on trivium logic. There are about 40 pages covering all sorts of different topics, from the laws of thought to ontology and logic, to categorical propositions, to the square of opposition, to modal propositions, to inductive syllogisms, and much more. And I also have a newsletter. You can get the newsletter for free. I'm planning to send out more messages in the future. I know I haven't been regular with them, but I want to do so in the near future. But you can sign up to my newsletter. That's one way to keep in contact with me, get updates, and get some inside information. In any case, thank you for watching this video. And if you like my work, check out my website, amateurlogician.com.